Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Invention of Scarcity, Malthus and the Margins of History, by Deborah Valenze. Narrated by Suzanne Toren. Publisher's note: this audiobook contains references to visuals present in the print and e-book editions of the book. Preface. We live in an era preoccupied with issues of social justice, global inequality, and environmental degradation, making this a good time to talk about the historical roots of scarcity in relation to food. For the past decade, I've taught a course on the history of European food that begins with two propositions: everyone needs to eat, and everyone once worked at procuring food. The story necessarily shifts over the millennia to property ownership and land use, then over the centuries to agricultural improvement, industrialism, the modern market, and hunger in a world of plenty. Missing from required reading in these contexts is an explicit historical analysis of how food became a transactional variable like anything else, most noticeably for those who could least afford it, and often for those whose ancestors might have produced it. Contemporary production of food, caught up in a complex system of marketing, encourages modern consumers to disregard such fundamental questions. To my mind, Malthus stands at the center of this, though his role has never emerged in a straightforward way from his own writings. Scholars in charge of his legacy generally recognize that Malthus held outdated ideas about economic growth, but they nevertheless value his insights into economic life and sexual reproduction. Most well-educated people believe that Malthus was a Malthusian in favor of limits to individual reproduction, yet correcting that misunderstanding only deflects attention away from more important prior questions about who governs available resources, their use, and their distribution. As one of the founding theorists of neoliberal economics, Malthus played an important part in ordering our thinking about these issues. The ecological trap implicit in his story poses a timely question for a new generation. We need to look at what he had to say whenever he actually talked about food. I have pondered Malthus on multiple occasions during my own career as a student, a teacher, and a scholar, wrestling against the perplexing power of his formula. Only recently did a fissure appear in his historical armor when I had a crucial insight while reading his diary of travels to northern Norway. I had just completed a book on the history of milk when I encountered his meticulous chronicle of reindeer dairying by the Sami people, and I had a hunch that those pages offered a clue to the larger issues embedded in his famous Essay on the Principle of Population. Though Malthus had devoted considerable energy to this exercise of observation, the people of Lapland figured nowhere in his definitive revision of the essay in 1803. It was clear that the northern herders posed a problem of translation, to borrow a phrase from Dipesh Chakrabarti, as an anomalous feature of human life outside European civilization. Here was an unexpected way to pry open the constraining, conventional context of political economy, which left no room for alternatives to a very specific standard of food production. I am not the first to question Malthus's narrow gauge for humanity, yet historians have stood back from asking how much Malthus actually knew about the rural world. When presented with practical evidence, he tended to hold fast to theoretical positions and dismiss matters that failed to correspond to his own model of social and economic life. His inattention to the productive work of women, including within the dairy, led to obvious problems in understanding the survival strategies of ordinary families and the interplay between rural and commercial society. I devoted a chapter to that fact in a book on women workers in Britain, going as far as to label the key transitional phase of industrialism as the Age of Malthus, when the work of women was subsumed under the larger project of creating a civilized female sex in the early 19th century. Now I realize that the essay's narrow comprehension of rural inhabitants, by far the majority of the European population during his lifetime, and his peculiarly negative view of pastoral life, deserve deeper analysis. They point to assumptions about the longer history of humanity and our basic interactions with the environment. Malthus was committed to an 18th-century model of social progress, what I identify as stadial theory in what follows, that rendered backward rural producers, along with pastoral peoples, as vestiges of the past and obstructions in the path of progress. I soon became aware of an equally influential system of human classification embedded in that body of thought, which Malthus helped to cement into place at the beginning of the 19th century. His narrow gauge carried important implications for the history of agriculture, particularly for those occupying the margins of rural society, and, significantly, colonial spaces that would be deemed marginal in nature by Western European nations later in history. In order to pursue a new view of Malthus, I have adopted an interdisciplinary and synthetic approach to a wide array of subject matter in British, European, and environmental history. Scholarly research has grown increasingly specialized and narrow over the past few decades, particularly in the empirically grounded methodologies favored by British historians. Larger arguments are often only implicit in the work of junior scholars, who may worry about securing employment and acceptance in their fields before treading on academic minefields. In the course of researching this book, I was struck by how many important findings lay untapped, and thus unfulfilled, as it were, either because they spoke to a narrow subspecialty, or because times had changed and the general direction of research had left evidence and ideas undiscussed. In many ways, then, my argument rests on the shoulders of several generations of scholars who came before me. By necessity, this book begins with a consideration of the general argument of Malthus, including its persuasive power as a hieroglyph for scarcity. Relying on grain agriculture as a universal measure of food and civilization, Malthus offered a dire forecast for food production alongside humankind's propensity to reproduce. The explanation for the origins of these two constructs lies in the context in which Malthus wrote his essay. Chapter 2 examines biographical details contributing to Malthus's profound rebellion against Enlightenment optimism and centuries-long customary benevolence shown the poor in Britain. Malthus reacted against his father's infatuation with Rousseau, a fact that merits closer examination and that provides insight into the contrary orientation of his writing. The dramatic tenor of the essay was hardly new to 18th-century readers of Gibbon and the Ancients, but as Chapter 3 notes, Malthus used these very sources as a basis for his own origin story about the connection forged between civilization and cultivation, posed against the savage existence of barbarians. Within this depiction lay an important dynamic of power. Writ large, as a struggle against nature, Malthus aligned his arguments with mainstream agricultural production of wheat, or corn, and its physical realities in the English countryside. Given what we know about marginal forms of rural life that were eclipsed and overruled by agricultural improvement, this chapter establishes a way to think about such oppositions in relation to property ownership, land use, and marginality. Malthus mined the texts of political economy in order to fashion his own portrait of the way in which indigenous populations related to the environment, analyzed in Chapter 4. The ignoble savage of the New World provided him with a foil reminiscent of Rousseau, but with a sleight of hand, Malthus rendered the concept just as pertinent to the laboring classes of Britain. Their lazy inattention to the commands of nature proved that the staff of life demanded urgent defense, represented by the British plan for civilization. As primitive human beings, savages reminded the cognizant reader of categories of humanity destined to inferiority. Buoyed up by the case for wheat cultivation, Malthus adeptly negated other paths to agricultural modernity. To place this strategy in its proper context, an interlude following Chapter 4 gives a brief history of the centrality of bread to European culture. Chapter 5 moves beyond the prescribed formula of modern agriculture in order to see the dominance of grain agriculture within a longer trend, the Great Domestication, as a framework for cultivation on a global scale in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. All these threads, though distinct, are intertwined within the story of how Malthus's essay aligned social attitudes with the emergence of a new era of economic thought. Two final chapters examine life worlds outside the model of modern Western European economies. Chapter 6 takes the fundamental test for property ownership used by the British, the act of employing the land beneficially through cultivation, and measures its capacities within a wholly different ecosystem. Malthus searched the Scandinavian settings he visited for familiar paternalist arrangements of British agriculture and social relations, which he seemed to have found in isolated settlements here and there. What he missed seeing is worth our consideration. His voyeuristic visit to a Sami settlement, like the ponderings of John Locke over America, revealed their territory to be an amalgam of place, time, and a familiar ethnic imaginary. Malthus viewed the Sami people from a conceptual distance, and felt no compunction about applying a measure of superiority to them. A more anthropological approach to humans and animals in their relationship to the environment uncovers the limitations of the aspiring political economist. While Malthus believed that indigenous peoples carried on a brutish, parasitic relationship to their environment, my account aims to turn the tables. His refusal to eat the products of the region, and his wish to shoot a valued bird of prey, shed light on the closed categories of history and humanity he brought to the task of population theory. History cannot be undone. Yet Chapter 7 attempts to unravel historical developments in order to imagine different designs with possible alternative outcomes. To this end, I have used the detailed work of agricultural economist Esther Boserup and rural historian Joan Thirsk, whose perceptiveness enabled them to make arguments for diverse approaches to agriculture. Their findings went against the grain of contemporary work in their respective fields, development studies and agricultural history, yet they pursued their points at great length. Both women argued that in rural development, a great deal of evidence was dismissed without a hearing in the court of history. In light of the inadequacies of monoculture and trade policies that extinguished the small landholder and producer, they illuminated alternative pathways for rural inhabitants in Europe and the global South. Such options may have been more sensitive to soils, climate, and livestock, as well as the autonomy of people rooted in a variety of settings. Sustainability was not a term in use when they did their fieldwork, but it has been applied to their evidence in retrospect. The ideas of Malthus have left us less able to deal with food insecurity and precarity in our own times. So we must forge new ways of thinking about land use and resources. At least one thing is certain. When returning to the questions raised by Malthus, we are more likely to arrive at clear approaches to the production of food by using a wider gauge for humanity. 1. Immortal Malthus. Food is essential to human survival. Without sufficient nourishment, people are unable to perform ordinary tasks, and they eventually weaken, sicken, and die. Given the wealth and plenitude of modern nations today, starvation is an unconscionable form of suffering, which governments over the past several centuries have aimed to eliminate. These statements stand as commonly held assumptions, yet they exist alongside defiant misunderstandings that act as barriers to achieving basic goals. For example, the general public doubts that enough food currently exists to feed everyone on our planet. Typical views often echo the erroneous bestseller of 1971, Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, which presented human beings as hapless creatures on an inevitable path to numerical self-destruction. Starvation appears as inherently related to scarcity and a surplus population. According to this line of reasoning, the fault lies in reproduction, particularly when it occurs among poor populations and in economically vulnerable nations. Aiding people in such circumstances, so the reasoning goes, will only result in their passive dependence and heedless numerical growth. At a more strategic level, serious problems of food distribution stymie efforts at eradicating hunger. The production and supply of cheap food in modern Western countries overwhelms local economies elsewhere and enforces particular market practices. Farmers in wealthy nations are often paid to take land out of production or destroy crops that are deemed overabundant. At the same time, people who live on the land, in rich countries as well as poor nations, can lack the resources to eat, just as urban residents find themselves in food deserts that obstruct the way to affordable nutrition. In the realm of global politics, food exists within a complex web of transactional assumptions. Powerful players demand certain conditions in exchange for basic necessities, including food. Vulnerable nations are forced to accept terms dictated to them, while lacking resources for alternative agricultural strategies. Universal in nature, food is relentlessly entangled in circumstances that limit its production and distribution. This complicated picture presents a strong case for revisiting the world of the 18th-century population theorist Thomas Robert Malthus. In a brief polemic, an essay on the principle of population, 1798, Malthus presented two fixed laws of our nature, the necessity of food for existence and the passion between the sexes, as unavoidable and constant. He then made an incendiary move. He linked the two laws to each other, arguing that while food increased at an arithmetical rate, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on, population would proceed at a more rapid rate, doubling with each interval, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, etc. In a perfect world, Malthus reasoned, a man, his use of the gendered pronoun here is worth noting, might ask himself whether he may not bring beings into the world for whom he cannot provide the means of subsistence. Restraint from marriage could mitigate the necessary effects of upward pressure on resources. In reality, he argued, constant effort towards an increase in population simply translated as sexual activity, rolled forward, meaning that ordinary people, especially when well fed, nevertheless coupled and reproduced without inhibition. Misery or vice generated a downward spiral, particularly among the lower classes, who could not afford to support their numerous offspring, yet seemed incapable of limiting their own numbers. The ultimate outcome was inevitable depletion of the earth's food supply. According to Malthus, without proper restraint among those who could not afford their own maintenance, humankind was likely to remain locked within a perpetual cycle of biological peril and necessary famine. Malthus's essay instantly ignited debate and passionate rebuttal. In his own decorous phrase, the work excited public attention. Contemporary readers could discern glaring contradictions between the lines of his Newtonian reasoning. The rich were not in danger of starving, nor did they give much concern to limiting their own numbers, while the poor were threatened by the rising price of food, unemployment, and political repression in the wake of the French Revolution. Since the time of Elizabeth I, propertied English people had assumed responsibility for rescuing the needy poor, whose resources were sometimes limited to the brink of starvation. The path to civility was not easy. A long and complex history of grain marketing in times of dearth reveals the self-interest of merchants and landowners alongside tumultuous popular conflict over distributing food and resources to the masses. By the late 1790s, stopgap arrangements showed signs of strain as poor rates climbed and prices soared. Just as market forces and customary benevolence collided, Malthus's formula, linking food production and human reproduction, entered the maelstrom. From 1798 onward, the age-old debate over the entitlements of the poor and the responsibilities of the wealthy classes was forever colored by his polemical utterances. The methodical thinking of Malthus, perceived as scientific by the standard of the time, appealed to his fellow Britons. Even when the logic of his argument came under attack, his intellectual toolbox would preoccupy economic theorists for a century. Events of the 1790s generated a special receptivity to the kind of polemic embedded within Malthus's pages. Political turbulence lent force to the fear of the famished and distressed poor that was felt by propertied elites, who recoiled from news from France following the Revolution. The conservative establishment in Britain embraced Malthus as a valuable truth-teller, and, remarkably enough, his essay helped to bring about a complete overhaul of the Elizabethan poor laws, accomplished in 1834. More crucially, his principle of population lived on as the foundation of scarcity in formal economic terms, applied with shocking disregard across the colonial world, and enshrined in later 19th-century neoclassical economics. Like his near contemporary Adam Smith, Malthus still stands as shorthand for an entire system of thought. Despite the need to interrogate multiple issues at stake, all of them rooted in 18th-century contexts. Tracing the genealogy of basic assumptions about food and its production and consumption provides a surprisingly illuminating exercise. Through rereading Malthus, we can see how food became conceptualized as a transactional variable, subject to particular logics that trapped many people in precarious circumstances. Some observers understood this at the time, at least with regard to European settings. As Marx wryly commented, Ireland was the promised land of the principle of population, proof that a potato-consuming population multiplied to the limits of subsistence while a market-driven supply of Irish wheat and meat bypassed powerless inhabitants. During the halcyon years of the Corn Laws, Irish grain and beef fed the populations of London and the Caribbean, crowning the trade strategy that enriched landowners while starving the lower ranks of Irish society. The link between the food supply and Irish reproduction rates appears grossly irrelevant when placed in the context of these larger connections having to do with the British state and trade policies. In fact, Malthus's tract can be seen as minor punctuation in the attenuated emergence of free trade, a development that did more to determine the history of food than public debate over assistance to the poor could ever hope to accomplish. By training our gaze upon 18th-century food production and its environments, this treatment of Malthusian ideas focuses instead on the structural inequality at the heart of Malthusian thinking. Political scientists and anthropologists have been particularly attuned to this fact when tracing basic Malthusian arguments as they circulated swiftly throughout modern economies. Malthus's principles easily migrated to remote settings, serving to legitimate theories of eugenics, colonialism, and the Cold War. Eric B. Ross's The Malthus Factor, Poverty, Politics, and Population in Capitalist Development tracked the lethal effects of the demographic determinism embedded within the nimble formula. As Ross argued, formulations provided by Malthus served to support unequal distribution of resources, including control over land use, within British colonial expansion, leaving a lasting imprint on developing nations. Voices from post-colonial settings have attacked the Malthusian scarecrow to expose the truth about food supplies behind the condition of hunger. As Amartya Sen forcefully theorized, famines only occur when populations have no way of exchanging labor for food. His entitlement theory of famine, delineated roughly 180 years after Malthus released his genie from the bottle, demystified the theory of population as it operated within contemporary economics. Sen argued that the only way people have been able to exercise entitlement to food is through market practices, either by earning wages or by selling their own goods. These terms have left many poor, landless laborers and urban workers dangerously vulnerable to arrangements that exclude them and economic downturns that render them unemployed. Nevertheless, such obvious limitations seldom have discredited conventions of governance and trade. Sen spoke from the experience of witnessing deficiencies of distribution leading to the Bengal famine of 1943. Starvation is the characteristic of some people not having enough food to eat. It is not the characteristic of there being not enough food to eat. And yet, Malthus's zombie continues to stalk our efforts to think about food and justice. Alex de Waal, executive director of the World Peace Foundation, coined this term to help disentangle the simplistic ideas of Malthus from lived realities. A zombie concept, borrowed from Ulrich Beck's writings, is an idea that cannot be killed by normal means and with limitless endurance keeps coming back to torment and infect the living. The canonical concept of famine, capitalized, is one of these. Actual causes of famines, de Waal argues, lie in political conflict and the weaponization of food. He shows that famines almost disappeared from world history before making a more recent resurgence as a highly specific feature of warfare. Yet contemporaries often default to crude reasoning that relies on incorrect suppositions.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?